Hello, hello, hello. So what I'd like to talk about today is the evolutionary origins of homosexuality, pederasty, and paedophilia. In many ways, this was inspired by the fact that I was at a pub in Oulu, northern Finland, where I live, with a friend some years ago, and we got talking to a pair of brother-in-laws. They were Dutch, and we got talking about the usual kind of things you talk about when you're middle-aged. Do you have children, that sort of thing. And one of them explained that no, he doesn't have children because he's gay. And he told us that he often feels quite sad about this. He feels quite sad about the fact that, as it were, genetically speaking, he won't live on. He said he didn't want to adopt because it wouldn't be the same. They wouldn't be his children. He didn't want to do something through IVF and a surrogate or whatever because they wouldn't be the children of both him and his partner. And so he was resigned to the fact that he wouldn't be, as it were, passing on his genes. And this was something that made him feel quite unhappy, really, and quite pensive. And I couldn't understand this, and I explained to him, well, surely you know that there are other ways than just indirectly to pass on your genes. I mean, yes, there's having children and passing on your genes that way, but there's other ways of passing on your genes, and one of those is the gay, what's called the gay uncle theory. And in fact, it may well be that the reason that we have homosexuals in the population is precisely because having a homosexual uncle helps you as the nephew to survive, because more resources are being invested in you. And this is why homosexuality has been selected for and stays in the population. It works at the level of the kin group. And he was very interested by this. He was fascinated by this, and it hadn't really occurred to him. And it seems that it's something that hasn't occurred to a lot of people, that there could be sound evolutionary reasons why there would be homosexuality, and not just why there would be homosexuality, but also why there would be pederasty, and even perhaps why there would be paedophilia, but certainly why there would be pederasty. And so this is what I want to look at today. Now, certainly, it seems quite clear that homosexuality is not simply some modern phenomenon that's a result of mutant genes or whatever because of weakened Darwinian selection or something like that. It's not some, in evolutionary terms, there's not some deviation. And evidence for that can be seen in the fact that, firstly, it's significantly genetic. It's about 40% in males. Sexuality, sexual orientation is about 40% genetic. And secondly, and most importantly, it can be seen in very primitive tribes. For example, among the Samba of New Guinea, when neophytes begin their process, their rite of passage of becoming men, which lasts between the ages of 7 and 10, they have to fellate the initiates every day and swallow their semen. Now, this is based around the belief that that the only way you can get semen is from another man, and therefore you have to suck him off and swallow his semen. But it demonstrates that homosexuality exists even at these very primitive tribes that are under conditions of natural selection. Equally, there are many other tribes in the Amazon area and so on that we know that during the rite of passage, the males together practice homosexuality, including anal sex. So it's quite clear that this is something that is in evolutionary terms is not an aberration. It's to some extent a kind of norm, and so therefore it raises the question how it can be selected for. What could be the evolutionary factors behind homosexuality? Now, there are a number of possibilities that have been selected. One of them is known as that have been suggested. I'm sorry. One of them is known as the gay uncle theory, and this is, as I mentioned earlier, is the idea that particularly if a female has a brother who is homosexual, then he may have a gay sexual partner, but he certainly won't have any children of his own, at least not under conditions of natural selection. And so, accordingly, in order to pass on his genes, he will do so indirectly by investing his resources in his nieces and nephews, who will, of course, carry 25% of his genes. And he will particularly do so with regard to the children of his sister, because if they're his sister's children, he can be sure there's no paternity anxiety or whatever. He can be sure that they are genuinely his nieces and nephews. If it's his brother's children, it's possible that his brother's wife has slept around, so he can't be sure that they're his. But if they're his sisters, they can be sure that they're his. And interestingly, this Dutch man who I mentioned, this Dutch computer programmer who I mentioned this to, commented that he's actually particularly close to the children of the brother-in-law who he was with, i.e. to his sister's children, which in evolutionary terms makes sense. Now, it's been demonstrated that females who have a homosexual brother actually tend to have elevated levels of fertility, which would imply that this homosexual brother factor is an evolutionary norm. It's been selected for alongside other things that are of use in evolutionary terms, such as being highly fertile, and so they've kind of come together, and so this demonstrates the veracity of gay uncle theory. Now, the problem with gay uncle theory is firstly that there is no empirical evidence based on modern studies that homosexual uncles actually do disproportionately invest in their nephews and nieces. And secondly, it raises the question of, well, why should they be homosexual rather than asexual? Wouldn't it be better if they were asexual? If they're homosexual, they're investing in some homosexual partner or something. If they were asexual, they could be purely investing in the nephew or niece. Now, a counter-argument to the first problem is that it may be that since the collapse of Darwinian selection, there are two kinds of homosexual, if you like. There are these group-selected homosexuals who do invest in their nephews and nieces and who are part of gay uncle theory, and you would expect those to be healthy, to have good genes and so on. And indeed, one of the things that this Dutch guy who invested in his nephew commented on was that he's never sick, he's never ill. But the second kind would be those who manifest as a consequence of mutant genes, and there is certainly evidence in general that homosexuality is a matter of developmental instability. That is to say, it correlates with evidence of things having gone wrong genetically. It correlates with all kinds of conditions. It correlates with depression, it correlates with anxiety, it correlates with suicide, it correlates with left-handedness, and in evolutionary terms the norm is to be right-handed, and left-handedness is therefore a deviation, and it normally is associated with things having gone wrong in development or in genetic terms, and it's associated with all kinds of illnesses and worse health and lower intelligence and this kind of thing. Homosexuality correlates with Crohn's disease, all kinds of problems. So it may be that there are, as it were, two kinds of homosexuals. There are the gay uncle homosexuals who are products of evolution, and there are these more recent manifestations, and it may be that it's the gay uncle type homosexuals that are selected for, and it's the others that are not, and therefore this messes up with the extent to which gay uncles invest in their children in modern times. So but it certainly would imply that there's more to it, because we've got to than simply gay uncle theory, because we have to ask ourselves, well, why is it that they're having gay sex with other men when they could simply be investing in their nephews and nieces? But anyway, that's the first idea, gay uncle theory. The second idea, which perhaps makes sense of the problems with gay uncle theory, is what's known as what sometimes is called the Johnny Depp theory, which has been developed by my colleague Edward Miller. And what he argues is this. Basically, of course, females select for male characteristics. They find manly men attractive because those men can, you will look after them and can win fights and all this kind of thing. But they don't do so to the extreme. They do find manly males attractive, but what is optimally attractive is a masculine male with some feminine traits. And these feminine traits, i.e. agreeableness and conscientiousness, are attractive because if a man has some of these feminine traits, then not only will he, broadly speaking, be tough and be able to protect the woman and so on, but he will be a good father, he will be a kind person, he will invest in the offspring, he won't knock his wife about, he won't have affairs, he won't, and therefore put his resources into somebody else. He'll be able to make social networks better because he'll be agreeable, and so there is an advantage to being attracted to a man who has some feminine traits, and therefore what would be selected for would be these manly men, but some feminine traits would stay within the male gene pool. Now, what that would in turn mean, of course, is that sometimes, simply by genetic chance, all those feminine traits would manifest in one man. And when that happened, he would be so feminized that he would literally see the world as a woman, and therefore he would be sexually attracted to men. Now, there's certainly good evidence that homosexual males tend to be, to varying degrees, of course, tend to be feminized males. Their intelligence profile is more female. They tend to be worse in spatial intelligence and better in linguistic intelligence, that kind of thing. Their personality is more female. They tend to be higher in agreeableness and higher in conscientiousness and so on. And so and even in terms of their physical appearance, they tend to be more female. They tend to have their 2D/4D ratio tends to be higher. So the difference between this finger and this finger, for example, which is a marker of testosterone. So there is a degree to which that is true. And so that may help us to understand the problem with gay uncle theory as well. It may be that homosexuality is explained by a combination of gay uncle theory and the benefits of having these feminine dimensions within the male population. And so when those two come together, as it were, when this and what perhaps we would say asexual uncle comes together, you have gay uncle. You can see how the two theories can work together. Now, a third theory is that homosexuality is to do with reducing conflict in a society where there are basically too many men. In most of these societies, in conditions of Darwinian selection, the societies are polygamous because the females are sexually attracted to status in men in a way that men aren't the other way around. Men can have sex with lots and lots of women, and they don't really lose anything from doing so, and so therefore they are selected to just have lots of sex with lots of women who are good looking and young and fertile and try to pass on their genes. Because the woman gets pregnant and because the woman is lumbered with a child and so on, then of course her inclination becomes to select for a man who's prepared to look after her and look after the child, because that will mean that both she and the child are more likely to survive. And so as a consequence of that, you end up with a situation where she'll sexually select for a high-status man, and the high-status man will be more than happy to have lots and lots of wives, of course, and has lots of children, and so you end up with lots of men who don't have wives. I mean, among the Kalahari, for example, so among the Bushmen, the Kalahari, it's about 40% of men never have children, and that's fairly standard among these kinds of groups. And so how do you deal with this problem of all these men fighting over the few available women? Well, homosexuality would be one way of doing this. And so if there's lots and lots of men who can't access the females, then you would expect homosexuality to be evolutionary use at the group level, because it would reduce group conflict, and it is the groups that are highly cooperative internally, according to computer models, and highly aggressive externally, that survive in terms of the battle between groups for group selection. And so therefore by having homosexuality, you are increasing the level of in-group cooperation. And this is demonstrated in the fact that when females have children, the more sons they have, the more likely that son is. So the younger the son is, the younger down the line the son of many, many sons the son is, the more likely he is to be homosexual. And this is because what seems to happen is that if the female gets pregnant with a son, that son releases male hormones essentially into the woman's immune system. The woman's immune system reacts to this by overwhelming it with female hormones, and therefore it's neutralized. Now, as she has more sons, she becomes more used to these male hormones, and therefore she's able to overwhelm them to a greater extent, and therefore the sons become more and more feminized until at the very youngest level the very younger sons tend to be homosexual. This of course means that these sons aren't going to be fighting over the few available women, the ones that are homosexual, so it reduces this in-group conflict. So that's a third possibility. A fourth possibility is one that I've been developing, and I look at it in a great deal of detail in a book that I have coming out in March called Churchill's Headmaster, the Sadist Who Nearly Saved the British Empire. And this is called what I call the gay shaman theory. So at a group level, it would be of use to have essentially a celibate caste, a caste of people who do not have children themselves, and consequently invest their energies not even in their kin, but simply in the good of their ethnic group. By doing so, if they are, let's say, shamans, if they are the religious leaders of the group, then what they are doing is they are inspiring the group. They are helping the group to be more religious through the various miracles and wonders and so on which they perform. So they're elevating its religiousness, and it's been shown in evolutionary models that religiousness tends to elevate ethnocentrism, and as we've seen, it's the ethnocentric group that is more likely to survive. And so, in general, therefore, there is this, and they're also making people feel that they're cured and all this kind of thing. So, therefore, there is a definite use in evolutionary terms to having a celibate caste that invests in the good of the group, whether it is religious people or indeed whether it is geniuses, because there is some evidence, as I look at in my book with Michael Woodley, At Our Wits' End, that geniuses are group selected for. Geniuses that come up with these amazing inventions that benefit the group tend not to have children themselves. And so consequently they invest all of their energies, which might otherwise be invested in relationships and in children, in coming up with their fantastic inventions, and these benefit the group. So you can see how there is a benefit to any group to having a celibate caste of geniuses and of religious figures. That is going to benefit the group. The group that has these is more likely to survive, and therefore having them is going to be selected for. Now, how does this relate to homosexuality? Well, in a number of ways. In terms of shamans, we know from anthropological research with various tribes and so on that shamans do tend to be unmarried, they do tend to not have children, and they do tend to be, it depends on the tribe you're talking about, but it ranges from being openly homosexual to being extremely effeminate but celibate, and therefore probably homosexual, to even being transvestite. There are various Native American tribes, for example, where the shamans will get together and kind of pretend to be women and dress as women, and even, I don't know how they do it exactly, but kind of have these kind of ceremonies where they make it look like they're menstruating. So there seems to be quite good evidence across cultures that these shamans who dedicate themselves entirely to the religion and who are therefore group selected are homosexuals. And this actually follows because there is sound evidence that homosexuals are higher in religiousness, homosexual men are higher in religiousness than heterosexual men. And they are also more prone to religious experiences than heterosexual men. And so this makes sense, of course, because religiousness is predicted by the personality trait agreeableness. If you are high in agreeableness, then you are high in empathy and you are high in altruism. If you are very high in empathy, then you are very, very concerned about the feelings of others and you are very good at reading external cues of people's internal states from their faces, that kind of thing. And if you are very, very high in this, then it seems that you start to see evidence of a mind everywhere, including behind the world itself. And there's an element to which that's what believing in God is about, that you see this mind behind the world. There have been studies that have shown that when people pray, the parts of the brain that are activated are those which relate to dealing with a real person, with someone that's real and there, which is not the case with, for example, if under experimental conditions people are told to wish to Father Christmas or something. And so the implication of this is that the ability to believe in God relates to the ability to be high in empathy, which in turn relates to the ability to be high in agreeableness. Homosexuals are feminized men, and so therefore you'd expect them to be more religious, you'd expect more of them to be extremely religious, and you'd expect more of them to have religious experiences, and therefore more of them to be attracted to this religious life. And so it follows, therefore, homosexuals are more prone to being extremely religious indeed, and therefore are more prone to becoming shamans or priests or whatever. And so therefore this would help to keep homosexuality and genes that might cause it in the population, what I call, as I say, the gay shaman theory. And equally you can see, and I look at this in the book as well, that from research on Roman Catholic priests or whatever, there is a very strong prevalence of people who are homosexual, or at least celibate homosexuals, are becoming involved in the priesthood. Even in England, where the Church of England, of course, doesn't demand celibacy, still traditionally it's been a haven for homosexuals who have become priests, and particularly when homosexuality was illegal, it was a way to avoid people questioning your sexuality or whatever, that you would become a priest. So as I say, this is the gay shaman theory. There's also, I think, another element to this, which is that you could argue that it would benefit a society if its males would be trained to be warriors. And how can they be trained to be warriors? Well, they can be trained to be warriors by being taken away from the society and basically brutalized, inculcated with the ideas of the society, with the myths of the society and the mysteries of the society, and also through a system of harsh punishment and that sort of thing, basically turned into men. And many tribes have this exact system of the rite of passage. The rite of passage is brutal, the children are arbitrarily beaten, and the children are also sort of humiliated, really, particularly through being subject to really homosexual abuse. Also, during this process, they strongly bond with each other, and they do this through homosexual activity with each other. Now you can see how this parallels the stereotype of what went on at public schools and what went on at prep schools and so on, traditionally in England, particularly in Victorian England, where what the Victorians wanted to do, there were all these that ran these public schools and prep schools, like Churchill's headmaster. They were, who I think was a non-practicing pederast. They were familiar with Sparta and so on, and with what made an empire, and they wanted to imitate this, and they wanted to bring the system of Sparta, which involved exactly this system of abuse and homosexuality and pederasty, into England. Now, you have to, in order to make the upper class into warriors. Now, you have to ask yourself, this is where it gets quite interesting. We've got gay pederast theory, or gay shaman theory. What about gay pederast theory? I'm sorry, yeah, what about understanding pederasty? So if you like, pederast shaman theory, or you could call it something like that, or priest pederast theory. You have to ask yourself, in terms of running these rites of passage, why would a man want to spend a great deal of time with other people's sons? What possible motivation could he have? Why would you want to do that? Men are low in agreeableness. Men, therefore, are not particularly maternal, obviously, and therefore men don't tend to like spending time with kids. And they particularly don't like to spend time with other people's kids. That just is, they're not particularly intelligent. You can't have intelligent conversations with them. They turn your brain to porridge, as one ex-school teacher, public school teacher, told me. What's the point? What's the motivation, if you're a male, to become involved in these rites of passage? In other words, what's the motivation to become a teacher of relatively young children, as was the case with these various clergymen who ran these public schools, and particularly the prep schools? Well, if one motivation is obvious. If they're sexually attracted to the children, then you've got a motivation. If they're pederasts, if they are sexually attracted to pubescent boys, then you can see why they'd want to become teachers, why they'd want to do this. It would provide them with a motivation for doing something which would ultimately be good at the group level. Now, there was a book which I cite in Churchill's Headmaster, where a psychiatrist, two psychiatrists, one of them was called Stevens, argue precisely this case. They say that a lot of teachers, as far as they're concerned, male teachers, are motivated by pederasty or paedophilia. They are sexually attracted to their charges. Most of them are able, of course, not to act on it. They don't act on these people who are pederasts or paedophiles. They don't act on it. They get sufficient pleasure or satisfaction by going into professions where they can be with young boys, like teaching or being a scoutmaster or whatever. And they bond with these boys, and they occasionally get to sort of touch them, not even in a sexual way, but they get to sort of touch them or whatever, and that's fine for them. Some of them will go a little bit further and do things that are a little bit dodgy or whatever, and some of them, a minority, will go too far and end up having sex with them. And indeed, this was the case among one of the teachers at Churchill's prep school, St George's Ascot. There was a teacher there called Robert Escort MacDonald, and after he was there, he went over and was teaching at a school in Winchester called Winton House, and in the end he had to leave because he was caught buggering one of the pupils. But this is a relatively rare thing. So you can see, therefore, that pederasty would be selected for and would stay in the population because it would act as a motivator to persuade men to organise these rites of passage, and these rites of passage which would turn boys into warriors, would be good for the group. So again, we might call this pederast teacher theory. There was a case in England some years ago where a judge by the name of Mary Jane Moat was sentencing a teacher from Reading in Berkshire, which is near St George's Ascot, for downloading child porn or something. And she commented that a lot of teachers, a lot of male teachers are sexually attracted to children, but they manage not to act on these impulses either in real life or on the internet. And I don't criticise you for being sexually attracted to children. And this caused the predictable outrage, the predictable cognitive dissonance of teachers' unions and whatever, saying, oh, how dare she say this, teachers are professionals, if you need to say it. Teachers are professionals, and of course they're not motivated in any way by sexual attraction. But this, of course, just evidences cognitive dissonance. We know, all of us, I think, that have been to a school, and particularly a boys' school, that of course there's a level on which single confirmed bachelors tend to be highly overrepresented among male teachers, and of course they do. And I had a number of teachers who I'm sure were probably pederasts. At my school, they didn't act on it. I mean, they might touch you a bit or something, put their arm round you, and you go, oh God. But otherwise they wouldn't act on it. But anyway, this could be there could be a level on which this is the case. A final reason which may be behind selection for homosexuality, which I suppose it relates to the issue of reducing intergroup conflict, is simply some kind of sexual outlet. So we've already seen that homosexuality is about 40% genetic among men. This means that it's about 60% a matter of environment. Oh, by the way, it's only 20% genetic among women, which implies that among men it's more evolutionary use, which would fit with these theories, by the way. But anyway, there's a strong environmental element to it. Now, it would make sense that if there were too many men and not enough women, you would have this in-group conflict. And we don't want that. So how can we deal with that? Well, if we had an inclination to become homosexual, if there were nowhere near enough women, then that would avoid the conflict. Then that would avoid, at least among a group within the population, then that would avoid the conflict which would be caused by all these men competing for a tiny number of women. And certainly you find in societies where women are secluded, societies where there is strict purdah, Afghanistan is an example, where they don't just wear the hijab, where they completely cover themselves. You can't even see women unless they're your sister or whatever. Then there are quite high levels of pederasty. It's endemic in somewhere like Afghanistan, pederasty. And equally you can see in Victorian England, when there was a degree to which women were under purdah and there was all these strict sexual ethics, pederasty among all these single upper class men was clearly a significant phenomenon. And in ancient Greece, or in periods during ancient Greece where there was essentially purdah, covering of women, veiling of women, then also you see the rise of homosexuality, where women aren't veiled in ancient Rome to the same extent, and so homosexuality, though tolerated, is not as prevalent. So it may be that there is some evolutionary use, and of course you have the concept of men being prison gay, and boys going through homosexual phases when they're at public schools and there's no girls. So I would suggest that if there's too many males and not enough girls, there would be some benefit to the society to avoid in-group conflict for an inclination at an environmental level. An environment would push you towards homosexuality, and there would be genes that would underpin that, obviously, and therefore it would mean that homosexuality would reduce in-group conflict and would stay in the population. So my view is, when people talk about homosexuals being perverts or whatever, I don't agree with that. I think there are sound evolutionary reasons for homosexuality. I think that if it wasn't for homosexuality, then our society wouldn't have dominated in the battle of group selection to the extent that it has. There is a distinct advantage to having a homosexual caste, in particular because that caste tends to be religious, or there's some association with genius. And as I say, I look at this in a great deal of detail in my book on Churchill's headmaster Herbert Snake Kinnersley. The book is called Churchill's Headmaster, the sadist who nearly saved the British Empire, and so it's not out yet, but it's to be out next month, and so please, you can put in a pre-order and whatever, and I hope you'll find more detail on it there, and you'll find it very interesting. Okay, well, I hope this has been of some interest, and thank you for tuning in, and thank you for all of you that have got in touch with me, the comments and so on. And if you have any ideas on this, I think it's a fascinating area, the evolution of homosexuality, and obviously, I don't propose that this has been solved. So please do get in touch with me, and let's debate this and so on. And please do subscribe because apparently that helps. And follow me on Twitter @JollyHeretic, and for goodness' sake, buy my books. But otherwise, if you have any homosexual friends, then please do tell them about this, because I think that this needs to be known to a greater extent. Okay, well, thanks for listening, and I hope you have a good week. and I will see you next week. Goodbye.